welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. Service on Celluloid is brought to you through the generous support of the Albert and Ethel Hertzstein Charitable Foundation. Just a quick reminder before we move on, you can now find us on Stitcher. Just navigate over there and search for Service on Celluloid, and you'll find us. This is our mini episode where I will go into more detail on some of the subjects we talked about in the previous episode. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and today I'll be continuing our discussion on the 1977 epic film A Bridge Too Far. Bridge Too Far covers the ill-fated airborne operation of mid-September 1944, codenamed Market Garden, designed and planned by British General Bernard Montgomery, with the intent to end the war by Christmas by dropping 3 Allied airborne divisions miles behind German lines in Holland in order to open a road across the Rhine River. Market Garden was a catastrophic failure in what was, until then, a stellar campaign for the Allies in Western Europe. Bridge Too Far stars Ryan O'Neal as James Gavin, Robert Redford as Julian Cook, Michael Caine, Sean Connery, Elliot Gould, Gene Hackman, Hardy Kruger, Maximilian Schell, Anthony Hopkins, and James Caan. A Bridge Too Far was directed by, and many more, by the way. A Bridge Too Far was directed by Richard Attenborough, produced by Joseph and Richard Levine, and based on the book of the same title, written by Cornelius Ryan. The film was a mild critical success and a financial disappointment in the United States.
We knew it was going to be rough. We knew we were, I would say, surprised, to say the least, to think that we could even get across that river. I guess you'd say that's the closest I ever came to believing that I might not make it.
That was the voice of Thomas Moffatt Burriss, talking about the crossing of the Vaal River. We'll hear more from him and more about the Vaal in just a little bit. Operation Market Garden is one of the rare instances of a Western Front battle post-D-Day that does not get a whole lot of attention here in the United States. The reasons for that are many, and we discussed a few of those, though, on the main episode. But in my opinion, anyway, the main reason it doesn't get much attention is because we lost, plain and simple. And it's unfortunate that the battle doesn't get more attention here in the States because it was significant. Around 17,000 Allied casualties were sustained because of and during Operation Market Garden. The 17,000 pale in comparison to the 83,000 plus sustained by the U.S., just by the U.S., in the Bulge a few months later, but nevertheless, 17,000 lives is still a very significant total. As I'm sure most of you listeners know, there were 2 American divisions that took part in this failed operation, those 2 being the 82nd and the 101st Airborne, of course. The 101st was the first unit to make contact with the Germans in the operation, and the first unit to also make contact with British 30 Corps as well. And before I get too deep into this, I have to mention something that the movie leaves out in its 3-hour marathon, and that is that there weren't just 3 bridges that the Airborne were to capture, but many. One of the things in the movie just says, the 101st is supposed to capture the Somme Bridge near Eindhoven, and 82nd Nijmegen Bridge, and then, of course, British 1st Airborne is the Arnhem Bridge, and that just makes it seem like there's only 3 bridges. It was far from that. There was more like, about 18-ish that they were supposed to be captured. The 101st main objective was 3 bridges, to be exact, one over the A River, one over the Dommel River, and the Somme Bridge over the Wilhelmina Canal. The Somme Bridge gets all the press because it was the target of the 506th. I mean, we all know about the 506th. 506th is the regiment, of course, in which Easy Company 506, the, quote, Band of Brothers, was part of. But the bridge over the Somme Bridge was destroyed, as is shown in the movie, directly in the faces of the onrushing Screaming Eagles. However, what is not shown in the movie is that the troopers didn't just stop, cuss, and wait for a bridging unit to come like they do, like Elliot Gould does in the film. Elements of C, D, and E Company 506th either swam across the river or tried to ford the river in order to establish a sort of beachhead on the other side, all the while under German fire. The 326th Engineers, who had jumped with the 506th, built a very unstable footbridge as troopers began to pour across as best they could. This seriously delayed the timetable, and you'll remember us talking about one of the things in Market Garden. It was all based on speed and time, and anything that slowed the timetable down threw everything else in disarray, and this was one of those instances. This delay meant that the 506th, who were supposed to have captured Eindhoven already, and linked up with 30 Corps the very same day that they landed, would not be able to do so until that night at best. Link up they would, and the 101st would achieve their objectives, albeit a bit late. The division would sit along a series of canals, rivers, bridges, and the road that 30 Corps would pass along for the better part of 2 months, Hell's Highway, as the Screaming Eagles would name it, would earn its name and sit in the memory of the troopers who served in the stagnant, almost World War I-like series of engagements, firefights, and seemingly endless artillery barrages. The other American unit involved in Market Garden, the 82nd Airborne Division, faced just as stiff a resistance, honestly probably stiffer, than that of their American brothers down the highway near Eindhoven. The 82nd, like the 101, had several bridges in their objective list, not just the Nijmegen Bridge, although that was certainly the most important. The bridges were numbered 7, 8, 9, and 10, and they lay along the route towards Nijmegen. All but one, bridge number 7, were either destroyed or too heavily damaged to be used by 30 Corps to get to Nijmegen. Of all the events that the 82nd got into during Market Garden, and there were quite a few, none stand out like the Vaal River crossing. This is the pivotal scene in the film in which Robert Redford, who played Julian Cook, Major Julian Cook, leads his men across the Vaal River in canvas and wooden boats in the face of furious German fire. General James Gavin, commanding officer of the 82nd, felt that in order to take Nijmegen Bridge, he would assault the bridge from both sides at once. And in order to do that, he had to get some of his men, namely the 3rd Battalion of the 504th Parachute Infantry, across the river. Provided with flimsy wooden and canvas boats by British engineers, Cook's men were flabbergasted at the thought of crossing the river in such craft. Now, the Vaal River, I've actually been there, is very wide. It's a very wide area. And it's about as wide as the Mississippi River is here in New Orleans. It's a very, very wide river with a very swift current. And the beach in which these guys were going to land on is flat and wide open, much like Omaha Beach. The men of the 504th were assisted by British Typhoon ground attack aircraft that strafed the opposite side of the riverbank, and in so doing received a tremendous amount of return fire from the Germans. It was a rather ominous answer to those troopers watching from across the river. The boats were supposed to have at least 8 paddles or more per boat, but most had fewer than 2. When asked what to use as paddles, Major Cook replied, "Use your rifle butts." At 15:03 hours, 26 boats went into the water. Each were laden with paratroopers, weapons, and ammunition. Almost as soon as the men hit the water, the Germans opened fire. They would not stop until the men reached the opposite shore, and even then, only after the Germans had been killed. The men were wide open for attack, with literally no cover whatsoever. The men were like ducks in a shooting gallery. The lead elements of the assault would be H and I companies of the 504th. The CO, commanding officer of I Company, was a young captain named Thomas Moffatt Burriss. T. Moffatt, as he was called, was to lead his company across the river in the first wave of attackers. Let's hear what T. Moffatt Burriss has to say about crossing the Vaal River.
The major highway bridge, the big one across the Vaal River, was held by German SS troops. SS troops was what I was trying to think of in Salerno earlier, by SS troops and Tiger tanks, and we couldn't get to them. Paratroopers fighting armor is not a very comfortable feeling, and we didn't have the right kind of weapons with us to fight armor at that time, so we were having a hard time. The general came up with the idea, well, let's go down 3 miles below the bridge and cross in assault boats and go around and hit both ends at the same time. Then all hell broke loose. Machine gun, 20 millimeter mortar, artillery fire came in. The water actually looked like a hailstorm was hitting it, little spouts of water shooting up in the air. Men were slumping in the boats. There were supposed to be 17 paddles per boat. There were only 5 average. And they said, paddle with your rifle butts. Well, hell spells, we didn't know anything about paddling boats anyway in the first place. They put 2 engineers in each boat to steer it. And they steered it with a paddle and using the paddle. And as we started across, the men were slumping in my boat, and the engineer that was steering it, I saw his wrist turn red, and he said, "Captain, take the rudder, I've been hit." And as I reached over to take the rudder, he caught a 20 millimeter high explosive in the head, blew his head completely off. I was covered with his blood, brains, and I caught shrapnel in my side, and had to dump him overboard because his shoulders went over in the water and the current turned the boat upstream. So I had to dump him overboard. Then I had to dump his body overboard to get the boat straightened up, And when I hit the other bank, 3 men had been killed and 7 wounded in my boat. And of the 26 boatloads that started to cross, 11 of them made it. And the boat that I was in, it was so full of holes it couldn't go back to pick up the second load it was supposed to do. Well, when we hit the north bank of the river, I yelled down to other men as they were landing, and I said, when I give the word, follow me, head for the dike, and don't stop for anything. So when about 40 men in fighting shape were there, I said, okay, now follow me. Well, we headed off toward the dike, right into the midst of that crisscrossing fire. How anyone got through it is a miracle. But we reached the dike with 17 men. Then I knocked out the machine gun that was in front of me and yelled to them, use your grenades, and they got the rest of the machine guns. Well, when we were crossing that pasture, that's a 1/2 mile pasture that we had to run straight into that fire. And when we got to the dike, then we started using the grenades. Started using grenades. I was using a Tommy gun. And in fact, the 2 guys that got up right in front of me from the machine gun, I didn't know whether they were giving up, whether they had grenades in their hands behind their back, or what. At that time, none of us even hesitated about shooting them. They had just 30 seconds before that just been mowing our men down. Yes, we were in a frenzy. We were just, you might say, almost out of control and being in a frenzy to get rid of them, to knock them out.
As Burriss said, the fighting didn't end once the survivors got on dry land. The men had to run across a good 150 to 200 yards across the beach, essentially, that was dominated by an ancient fort and a diked road manned by troops of the 10th SS Panzer Division. The 504th troopers ran up the beach and up the dike in spurts, in between furious torrents of fire, both enemy and friendly. Once up the dike, the men slaughtered any German within their sight. The troopers cleared the fort, the diked road, and headed towards the Nijmegen rail bridge at a trot. One of those troopers who had been lucky enough to survive the murderous Vaal River crossing was a grizzled veteran of H Company, a veteran of North Africa, Italy, and now Holland, Sergeant Theodore Finkbeiner. T, as he was called by his friends, tells us about what happened after the survivors made their way up the beach and towards the rail bridge.
First thing we hit was this little, we thought it was Fort Lint, but they found out it's got something else, a little fort with a moat around it, old-fashioned. And that's the first real fight we run into, but soldiers are there. And it wasn't very well protected. We had a few shots there. In fact, there's a lieutenant who killed him right on that ramp, went across the moat. I took a camera, had a little 35 millimeter camera I took away from him. He had a few undeveloped films on it. I don't know what happened in pictures that he took when they were building that thing, I got developed later. And from there, we went on to that railroad embankment. Like I say, when we was going up there, I started toward it. The minute I run up, of course, wasn't nobody on it when we looking at it. We run up to it. And the minute I got on it, I stuck my head up, and I was close to me to your face to the machine gun. The machine gunner. I ducked. He ducked, but he pulled the trigger on his machine gun, and I had one of them little wool caps. That's all I wore, and that muzzle blast blew that off the top of my head, and I had never seen it. They really didn't look for it before. He ducked down, and I started throwing hand grenades over, and there's 2 more guys right there with me. We started throwing hand grenades over, and they was throwing hand grenades over, and I said, the potato mash went all the way to the bottom of the embankment, just went off, and they don't have any fragmentation, so they didn't bother us a bit. They charged at us right there, right at us, right across. and we shot, and we shot him and killed some, and some dropped back the other side. And I know I was worried that when that M1 clip out of my rifle, I was wondering whether I was going to try to get another clip or had to stand up and fight with my rifle. But all up and down along that rail bank on the other side, you see the Germans be sticking their head up, and some of our troops were coming out across there and they're shooting. We was doing pop up and shoot one another and whatnot, which I was pretty good. I was better at that than most of them. And I had sense enough that I didn't pop up in the same place and shoot some more. I'd shoot and then I'd move down a little ways before I'd pop up and look, shoot again, and duck down. But anyway, we got that underpass deal, and right across under it was a machine gun they'd had set up over there. But they threw up a white flag. And I done learned, they say, I don't get up and go take no prisoners. I said, come over here. And they waved, come here. And then they started shooting. So we started shooting, and we knocked off that machine gun. And about that time is when we heard that all the shooting over toward the bridge, which wasn't far down there. A big mess, and the tanks was coming across the other bridge. And boy, they started running toward us down that railroad. Boy, we really killed quite a few of them there because they were running right on top of that levee right toward us. And we were sitting there with a gun waiting on them, and really had to kill a bunch of Germans there.
As the British tanks of 30 Corps rolled onto the rail bridge, the German defenders, realizing now that they were effectively trapped by the tanks in front of them and the furious survivors of the Wahl behind them, panicked and ran towards the troopers of the 82nd. Finkbeiner and others, who had now taken positions at the end of the bridge, now slaughtered those who had slaughtered them as they crossed the river. No quarter asked, no quarter given. Downriver, Burriss and his men were attempting to take the road bridge, gunning down Germans who had tied themselves to the bridge's girders, acting as snipers, and cutting demolition wires. Not long after, British tanks rolled across the road bridge only to be met by Burriss and his men. The Brits stopped their tanks once off the bridge and settled down for the night, to the amazement and fury of the 82nd troopers who had just went through so much to clear the way. The link-up with the British airborne in Arnhem clearly was no longer a priority. The Wahl ordeal was for all intents and purposes over. American casualties had been high, but by nightfall on the 20th of September, the 82nd had accomplished their mission and taken their objectives. They, like the 101, would remain in their positions until November. Market Garden was a failure as an operation. The blame could be put on many factors, not the least of which was the complexity of the plan, the reliance on one road for 30 Corps, and the complete intelligence failure that allowed the airborne to be dropped amidst SS and other highly trained and motivated German troops. Whatever the reasons for failure were or are, the war would certainly not be over by Christmas, as Montgomery had pledged. And with that, I want to thank you so much for listening. Tune in next week when we discuss the 1988 film Grave of the Fireflies. If you'd like to listen to the oral histories featured here today, please visit our digital collections at www.2online.org. That's www.2online.org. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on iTunes and Stitcher if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer, Tessa Jager, and our sound engineer, Jeremy Burson. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.